Boy, that was the best introduction of me I've heard in a long time, because it tells the truth. If you hear anything practical today, it will be because of my wife, who's a gifted early childhood educator. Even from when I was in graduate school, I would come home excited about the theories and the research I was doing, and she'd listen patiently, as a good partner does. And then she'd pause at the end and she'd say, well, that's all very interesting, Ross. But let me tell you what they're really like. And she'd go on to talk about her day. So this is why I'm so delighted to be with you, because it gives me a chance to do what two things that I hope to do in any presentation to a remarkable group like this. And the first is to offer the science and to hopefully provide the science in a way that will be useful to the good work that you do on behalf of children and families. But the other thing, and the thing that I will do right now, is to thank you for the good work that you do. Your work is not often rewarded, certainly not as it should be. It is often not thanked in the way that it deserves to be. And if I can be one of those who does so, then it is my honor and privilege to do so. So thank you for the good work that you do. Now, I noticed in the schedule that this period of time is listed as the first keynote. I also noticed that it's listed as the refreshment break. So I certainly hope that that's an optimistic suggestion that you'll find my comments refreshing. But if you don't, I want you to understand that I will not be offended if you walk to the back and actually refresh yourself, because I am, after all, an academic, and I speak like an academic. Part of my appreciation for what you do is reflected in some work that I've been involved with lately that I want to make sure right at the outset you're aware of. For the last year and a half, a Blue Ribbon Committee of the National Research Council, the Institute of Medicine, has been meeting to talk about the science of early childhood development, actually the science of learning from birth to age 8, and particularly what its implications are for what they call workforce development. And this has to do with all those professionals, from home visitors to early care and educators to K-12 or K-3 teachers, all of whom are involved in helping to promote the healthy development of children from birth to age 8. That report will be released within the next couple of months, and I alert you to it now because we have been working mightily in this committee, both to identify what the science is telling us about how children learn throughout this incredibly important developmental period, but also what the implications of this science are for people who are right at the front lines doing the hard work. And so I hope that that report will be of use to you, and I wanted to flag it for you right at the beginning so that you would be aware of it when it comes out. You know that we live in historic times right now. We live in historic times for many reasons, but one of the reasons that we will remember years from now as we look back on this period is that this is a period of absolutely historic change in our understanding of children, particularly young children, and how they grow and learn and develop. I mean, George mentioned earlier how much the science has come to change our thinking, and think of the fact that a couple of decades ago, it was really hard to get people to pay attention to what goes on in the early years. I know as one who tried to talk about young children that my ideas and the kinds of things that I was producing were often relegated to the back pages of news magazines if they ever made it there at all. But now, you can talk to the person on the street about early childhood development, and they will know it has something to do with brain development, and they'll tell you it has something to do that's really important for the child's future development. And if they're really on top of things, they'll say that what we do in the early years really does make a difference, but they don't know what it is. And if they're parents, they're often confused about what they should do. And that, of course, speaks to the challenge and the responsibility we face to try to bring that knowledge to them as well as to implement it in our own practice and in our own work with children. And of course, as George had mentioned, and as I've just pointed out, a lot of the impetus behind this has been this amazing work on brain development. So let's see if I can pull up that brain slide. No, back a little bit. There we are. The brain and the ways in which it is the science of early brain development has given us new understanding of what is going on that is helping to shape the architecture of the brain, and in particular, what kinds of things we can do to really make a difference. You know this story, I think. You know that as children are starting early in life, the brain and the neurons that populate that brain are exuberantly making connections all throughout the brain to other neurons to establish, in a sense, an architecture that initially, because of this proliferation of neurons, becomes absolutely dense. A one-year-old's brain is actually more fully packed than the brain of a teenager or an adult. And it reflects the way in which the brain is enlisting its potential to provide a densely networked set of connections that can help ready the child for life in the world. But the important thing is that not all those connections endure. There's a subsequent stage of pruning. Oh, there we go. There's a subsequent stage of pruning by which those connections wither away, some of them, others are strengthened and retained, and experience plays an important role in determining which connections remain and which do not. I want to emphasize that this last panel is not a bad thing. We would not want a brain for an adolescent or an adult that is as fully packed as a 12-month-old's brain is. There's a reason that the pruning goes on, and it's not because children are not stimulated enough, it's because the brain needs to work efficiently. It needs to move from the brain that is full of potential to a brain that has realized some of that potential based on the demands and the opportunities of the environment in which the child lives. So this brings us to the question that I want to linger on with you a little bit this morning because it makes a difference for what we do, which is to ask, why is the design of brain development one that relies on experience? Why is experience such an important part of the development of brain architecture? If it were up to me, I would have designed a genetic blueprint that would have helped to create a brain that was resilient in the face of different environments, but nevertheless capable. Fortunately, nobody asked me. And so I want to explore with you why experience is so important, the directions that experience can take children's development, and really what that means for what we do with children. And I think we begin to understand why the role of experience is so important when we consider the fact that a baby is born into a world of unknowns. A baby is born into a world of unknowns in which it's terribly, terribly important that some answers to the questions relating to the child's survival be addressed. Those unknowns include the following questions. Is the world a safe or dangerous place? Will there be other people to help me along? If so, will those people be warm and nurturant, or will those people be indifferent and maybe hostile? What do I need? How do I get the things I need to survive? And how do I connect with those people who might help me get those things? You can see how important those questions are to a child's survival. And although it will be years, if ever, before any baby or adolescent ever ponders those questions consciously, it nevertheless is true that the brain is sensitive to signals that help it provisionally answer those questions. And the reason is that it contributes to the brain's own rewiring, to fashion itself in a way that it can adapt itself to the conditions in which the baby has been born. That's why experience is so important, because babies grow up in different environments that require different capabilities, that provide different opportunities, and the brain is sensitive to signals that say, what kind of environment is this, and how do I need to refashion myself to make it work better here? Does that make sense? A straightforward example of this is in the area of language learning. One of the things that a baby cannot know is whether the accident of their birth happens to have situated them in Paris or London or Moscow or Kiev or Beijing or any other community around the world. The baby cannot know what kind of culture or particularly language has to be learned. And as a result, the child at birth, and for the first few months in the first year, is really a language universalist. The brain at birth is an incredibly powerful phoneme processing machine. Research studies have shown that the baby at 5 months of age is capable of perceiving most, if not all, of the phonemes of the world's language. That is, the speech sounds made all throughout the world's language. Indeed, that baby can make out speech sounds that even their parents can't discern. And it reflects the fact that the brain has readied itself to be prepared to get signals from any language in which the child may have been born about what language or languages they are going to have to learn. That's part of that potential that all the neural connections provide. But the fact is that a child is not an efficient language learner if they maintain all that potential for learning any of the world's languages. So the brain rewires itself based on what it hears, the language or languages it overhears. The brain rewires itself to become an optimal learner of one or two languages in their native environment. And that makes the child's brain much more efficient. As a result, it sets the stage for the vocabulary explosion that takes place just afterwards. That incredible increase in vocabulary could not happen if the brain didn't rewire itself, prune away some of that potential, and commit itself to becoming a particular language learner that is adapted to the environment in which the child lives. That's why experience is important. Now, that's not the only question that being born into a world of unknowns has to be addressed. Another question is perhaps even more important, and it has to do with, is this world safe or dangerous? There we go. Is this a world where I have to be alert for threats to my well-being? I have to be vigilant for dangers that may unexpectedly overtake me? Or is this a world where I can relax, explore, discover for myself safe and confident that unexpected dangers or threats might not overtake me? This might be the most important question the brain has to try to answer. And it begins trying to answer that prenatally. We know that babies in the last stages of pregnancy are already being affected by the intrauterine environment, including mother's stress hormones and other characteristics of that environment that help to signal the degree of adversity the mother is facing, and is one of the signals the brain uses in getting a sense as to the extent to which the world at large, when the child is born, is going to be facing that child with threats or dangers. And as that illustration from prenatal development suggests, the way in which the baby understands whether the world is threatening or safe is by the quality of care that child receives. Because a world of adversity is going to be reflected in care that is indifferent, stressful, or non-nurturant. A world that is safe is going to be reflected in care that is supportive and warm and secure. And so, astonishingly, babies look to the quality of care they receive. The brain looks to the quality of care that the child receives as a signal for what kind of a world am I growing up in. Now, I've been using the term stress, as has George, and it's important now to pause for a moment and to consider what we mean by our terms here. Because you have heard the term toxic stress, and this gives me an opportunity to clarify a little bit of how we understand what toxic stress is in relation to other kinds of stress and why it might be important. There are actually three kinds of stress, as you probably know. The first is, believe it or not, what we call positive stress. My undergraduate students don't believe there's anything like positive stress, but that's because they took a midterm exam yesterday. Turns out they did pretty well. And that's a good example of why stress can be positive, because where students are concerned, it mobilizes them to study, to get their act together, and to master the material. Where young children are concerned, positive stress equivalently contributes to the development of the child's coping capacities. So we want children to experience positive stress, which are stresses within the child's capacities to cope. You know, this may involve making friends with a new child, or coping with an adult's limit setting, or dealing with a nasty fall. You know, those are things that children most times can handle. Then there is another kind of stress that we call tolerable stress, and this has to do with circumstances that are more significant, but in which the child is capable of managing in large measure because somebody has their back, somebody is there to support them. So even circumstances such as a natural calamity, a natural disaster taking place that changes the child's neighborhood, or other kinds of major upheavals can be experiences of tolerable stress if there are adults there who are capable of helping the child manage that experience and coping with it adaptively. And this is where we get to the topic of toxic stress. Because toxic stress is not just stress that is severe and chronic, but it is primarily for a child's stress that the child has to face alone. And so when we think of what is toxic stress, we think of aversive experiences, threatening experiences, dangerous experiences that any of us would find overwhelming, and children do too. But children, especially young children, also experience as toxic circumstances in which they do not have the support of an adult, in which they are left alone, in which support is withdrawn, or in which those whom they've come to rely on are no longer available to them. We often don't think of toxic stress in this way, but what brain science is showing us is that children respond biologically to the withdrawal or absence of nurture and care, sometimes as strongly as they respond to experiences that are threatening or dangerous or otherwise overwhelming. Does that make sense? Okay. It's an importantly different way of thinking about toxic stress that I think is important for us in sensitizing us to circumstances we would not see as toxic, but which children experience in that way. So whether children are faced with toxic stress that consists of threats and danger and adversity, or toxic stress that consists of there being nobody there for you, what the research shows is that the neurocircuitry of the child's brain begins to adapt to that. Why? Because the brain is rewiring itself for life in a world full of stress and danger. And in particular, the stress-responsive biological system, the hypothalamic pituitary adrenocortical axis, you'll be tested on this at the end, rewires itself in one of two ways. Most commonly, it rewires itself to respond immediately and strongly and preemptorily to threat or danger. Not surprisingly, because if the brain is getting signals that the world is a dangerous place, it needs to react instantaneously and it needs to react strongly, otherwise those threats might actually overtake you. So that's one way in which the brain rewires itself. But there's also another way that is causing us some concern, which is in fact that the stress-responsive system begins to shut down. It does not show the activation we normally expect to see. It is as if it is beginning to shut down, to stop functioning. In either case, we see the behavioral consequences of this. When I speak about this to young early childhood educator groups, they know exactly the kind of children we're talking about, because these are the children they see in their classrooms all the time. These are the children who have difficulty managing their emotions, who get into conflict with peers because they overreact to circumstances that most other kids would not be bothered by. These are the kids who also fall apart when they're being reprimanded by an adult. In short, they have bodies and brains that are reacting to any threat because that might be adaptive in some environments where they're living. But when they get to the school environment, it proves to be not a very successful way of responding. Okay? This might be a familiar story to you, but what has also been shown in some of the research is that experiences of chronic stress, toxic stress as we've described it, also affect other parts of the brain. In fact, it turns out that the neural receptors for stress hormones are widely distributed throughout the brain. So they include, for example, not just the amygdala, that chilly red-shaped structure that I have circled here, but receptors that are sensitive to stress hormones can also be found in the hippocampus. That is a part of the brain that is primarily responsible for creating new memories out of current experience. If you remember anything from this talk, it's because your hippocampus has been active. And those stress receptors are also throughout the prefrontal cortex and structures of the prefrontal cortex. And the important thing about the prefrontal cortex is that it is that part of the brain that is directly related to self-regulation. It is the part that helps children manage their attention, their thinking, their behavior, and their emotions. Okay? So the bottom line is stress not only causes children's biological stress systems to rewire, it also affects many, many other parts of their brain. And in fact, recent research is showing that chronic stress also affects the immune system. It helps us understand why children who are in chronically difficult circumstances also fall victim to chronic diseases like asthma. And it's because of the immune effects of chronic stress activation biologically that cause these children to be more vulnerable to illnesses. This is important to us because it relates to all the characteristics that are required for children to succeed in school. When we think of the determinants of school success, we think probably most immediately of the cognitive skills that are necessary, memory, language, and so forth. Those thinking skills are impaired when children experience chronic and toxic stress because of their effects on areas of the brain governing thinking and reasoning and cognitive self-regulation. But also the learning skills, what James Heckman calls, unfortunately, the non-cognitive skills that are equally important to children's school success, are also affected by these experiences of chronic stress, having to do with the ability for focused attention, persistence, emotion self-regulation, self-confidence, and work habits. To state the issue directly, children who are in very difficult circumstances, and I'm going to suggest that probably about half of the children growing up in California today would fit that description, are having experiences of stress that are causing their brains to respond in ways that not only cause them to overreact to threat and challenge, but also impair their abilities to focus their attention, to sit still during circle time, to be able to concentrate on a cognitive challenge, to be able to manage themselves in social circumstances, to be able to pay attention to whether they understand the instructions and ask questions if they don't. In short, many of the learning challenges these children face may be in part the result of a brain that has organized itself for a world of adversity. And indeed, although we look at these characteristics as being ones that no child should ever develop, and that no brain in its right mind would ever want children to develop, we are guided by studies that are conducted with both monkey and rat colonies, which find that rats, for example, that grow up in conditions of chronic adversity are really, really good at fear conditioning. They're not particularly good at exploration and learning. By contrast, rats that grow up where caregivers are nurturing and supportive are not really good at fear conditioning, but they're really good at learning and exploration. The children that we are often facing who are experiencing stress in the rest of their lives may be really good at fear conditioning, but it's costing them in terms of exploration and learning. When I described that maybe half the kids in California today are in circumstances like these, what I'm referring to is the fact that one of the best studied models for how stress affects the brain biologically come from studies of children in poverty. And the statistics are really quite striking. We have roughly 21%, according to 2010 estimates, 21% of children in the United States are growing up in families that are below the poverty line. In California and elsewhere, of course, that's a very high standard for considering children in economic difficulty. And more commonly, researchers and economists will use a standard of 200% of the federal poverty level as identifying children who are in families in economic difficulty. And by that standard, we have close to 43% of children in California and the rest of the country, more in California, who are growing up in low-income circumstances that pose challenges to their well-being. Now, I should acknowledge, as George did, that not all children who are growing up in economic adversity experience toxic stress. And indeed, many children experience toxic stress in more advantaged circumstances. But the reason that poverty has become a model for studying the biological and behavioral effects of toxic stress is because in poverty, in economic adversity, children experience direct threats to their well-being, and they also experience threats that arise from caregivers who are unable to be a stress buffer for the child in the ways, as you know now, that children need. And as a consequence, there's been great concern for what are the experiences that already are setting these children behind. You remember that earlier figure that I showed you of vocabulary development that takes place in the first 3 years of life? You may be familiar with the Hart and Risley findings that plot vocabulary development now according to family income. And what you see is that after that initial period of the brain rewiring itself, children in homes that vary in socioeconomic status acquire vocabulary over the course of the first 3 years at remarkably different rates. As you may know, that children in the more advantaged families have vocabularies that are more than twice that of children in the other groups. And typically this is attributed to the fact that these children are hearing more vocabulary at home, that they're simply being spoken to more frequently by their caregivers, and that certainly is true. That has been the basis for public policy efforts like Providence Speaks, the effort in Providence, Rhode Island to encourage parents to talk and read and sing more to their children, as well as the Clinton initiatives, Too Small to Fail. But there are other findings from this study that add to that picture. And one of them is that the researchers identified the proportion of positive to negative language that children heard in these encounters with their parents, and created a ratio of the proportion of positive to negative words that were spoken to children. The ratio was positive for children growing up in economically advantaged families. In other words, the language they heard was positive and affirmative, often in the context of things like storybook reading, or talking about the child's experiences during the day, or other kinds of shared activity. The positive to negative language ratio was negative for children growing up in the most economically challenged families. And that is consistent with observations that children in these circumstances are often hearing language meant to control, direct, or reprimand them. That may be as important for the growth of children's language as the sheer amount of vocabulary they're hearing. Why would that be important? Because it turns out it's not just hearing language, but it's the context in which it occurs, and it's who they're hearing it with. The person who speaks to the child makes as much difference as the language that that person says. And that is all wrapped up in the importance of the relationships that children use and attend to in determining whether the world is a safe and secure place or a world full of threats and hidden dangers. Those vocabulary findings are important because how children have a working vocabulary at age 3 predicts many important aspects of their subsequent school achievement. So these figures, for example, here are plots of kindergarten academic skills by family income, with the green bar reflecting the performance of children from economic advantaged families, and the blue bar reflecting children growing up in families with economic difficulty. And what you find across a range of language and mathematics skills is that you're already seeing the achievement gap appearing before children have even started school. By the time they enter school, children therefore are already showing a gap based on family income level. Remarkably enough, contrary to our hopes and aspirations, their experience in school simply widens that gap. It doesn't narrow it. And this is one of the reasons that we all understand the importance of starting early, the importance of beginning well before children have entered school if we're serious about trying to narrow the achievement gap. So the question is, how do we do so? How do we think about providing, especially children at risk, with those kinds of experiences and opportunities that will give the brain different signals, that will help it wire itself in a way that is more constructive, or at least facilitating the kind of learning and self-regulatory and attention skills that will suit children well as they enter a classroom. And here the good news is that the same brain which is wiring itself in response to cues from the environment that are relevant to the child's survival is also a very plastic brain. It's a plastic brain in the sense that it is continually open to experience. It flexibly remolds itself, especially in the early years, according to new experiences. And in fact, that plasticity becomes one of the most significant assists we have in helping children to get started. Now, I have to clarify here that brain plasticity, this flexibility of the brain, does not endure forever. I got to tell you that at my age, this brain is not all that plastic. It's got some other qualities that I like, but its flexibility is not one of its distinguishing characteristics now. Some of you who are younger, who constitutes really the majority of you, have greater benefits in that. And the greatest, of course, advantage are for the youngest ones among us. And that is because of the ways in which the brain has not yet consolidated its neural architecture. To state the issue most strikingly, children who are growing up in any kind of adversity and its effects on the brain's wiring, that wiring is not hardwired. It does not create a brain architecture that cannot be changed. But there are two important messages from developmental neuroscience that we need to take seriously. One is that we need to start earlier, because it becomes economically and biologically more expensive to try to rewire brains after that consolidation has begun, rather than getting the wiring right from the beginning. That's where our incentive to begin early comes from. And the other lesson from developmental neuroscience has been implied throughout much of what I've told you, and so I'll make it explicit again. The most important cue to the brain about those questions, about that world of unknowns into which the newborn has come into the world, the most important set of signals that help to answer the questions about what the world is like and how do I get what I need to survive, come from the environment of care. It comes from how children are treated in the relationships that matter to them. And those are relationships that begin primarily and foremost in the home environment, but they are relationships that extend outside of the home as children move into early care and education settings, as they are cared for by members of the extended family, as they encounter others who matter to them. Those relationships also become some of the signals by which the brain begins to understand the world in which it lives. In our research at the University of California, Davis, we've been focusing particularly on what happens in those relationships that confers that sense of security and confidence that enable children to go off into the world with a sense that somebody has my back. This picture is taken from one of our research studies. Actually, the mother in this picture is here with us. And it was capturing an evocative moment when we had asked her and her son to recall a recent instance in which he was sad. And in this case, it happened to be the behavior of his friends in a video game where their avatars, he thought, were ganging up on his. A typical upset experience for a boy of 5. And notice in how the mother responds, the sensitivity with which she identifies his feelings, she validates his experience, she communicates clearly that she seeks to understand, and then she provides him with more information. She says, you know, you thought you were losing the game, didn't you? But it turns out you weren't. It's that kind of responsiveness, beginning from birth, beginning in some respects prenatally, that signals to the brain that you are not alone in this world, that there are other people who are there to care for you, and you can connect with them in ways that will help make experience manageable and your life one of great exploration. So I wanted to close by identifying for you some of where the potential exists. Nope, not that slide, this one. Where the potential and the exciting potential exists to provide this kind of support. Because now that we know what the science is showing us about how brains develop, we are now at the vanguard of new knowledge that we have not had before about how we can provide the support, especially for children in difficulty, that help them get a better start in life. One of these strategies has to do with two generation interventions for the family, recognizing that if we are only child-focused in our efforts, we miss the fact that children are getting signals from those they live with about what kind of a world this is. And if you can help parents be able to provide the kind of nurturing and supportive care, you have gone a long way to helping not just parents, but also their children. I mentioned earlier the National Research Council study that I'm involved with that will be releasing a report in the next couple of months. Let me also flag for you another National Research Council study that will take a little bit longer because it has just been impaneled. They just had their first meeting last month. And this one is focused on helping parents. Exactly this first agenda, through two-generation interventions, addressing parents' needs as well as those of children. In the context of these two-generation interventions, for example, people look at the benefits for parents and of children when parents are given opportunities to further their education, to become involved in job training, to obtain social support from those around them, and provided income support. Right now, Congress is considering, for example, whether to reauthorize training, or funding rather, for the federally supported program of early home visitation that has been such a success in clinical trials and in randomized control designs in making a difference, especially for families in difficulty. We're hoping Congress sees the wisdom, even in this Republican Congress, of extending that program. At the same time, a colleague of mine named Greg Duncan is a noted, internationally recognized economist, is gathering some support for an innovative program to ask, in a research context, a simple question. How much difference can you make for children if you provide simple income support for parents in economic difficulty? Does income support for parents help them develop the kind of nurturance, reduce the kind of stress that can, in the end, make a lot of difference for children? We'll have an answer to that, hopefully, if he gets funding soon. A second characteristic of strategies to support children has to do with school-based, child-focused programs. There we go. The Chicago School Readiness Project by Sibel Raver is one that is achieving national attention because of the recognition that although you can't always help the family, there are still things that can happen in school at various levels in helping children. The school-based Chicago School Readiness Project is designed to strengthen the self-regulatory skills that children in adversity often find lacking, and what they are discovering in the context of carefully guided attention to teachers to help children strengthen self-regulatory skills is that it is not only resulting in improvements in children's social and emotional classroom behavior, it is also improving their academic success because they're able to manage their attention and their thinking and their academic work. Finally, one of the most exciting areas of exploration for us has been looking at the effects of social support efforts for children to see whether we can find evidence that by providing support to children, we are not only changing their behavior, but we're normalizing their stress neurobiology. So I draw your attention to what is called the Multidimensional Treatment Foster Care for Preschoolers program, not because we've been talking about foster care this morning, but because if you're asking about children who have experienced toxic stress, oftentimes for many children, the foster care system is where that occurs. Because of the circumstances of families that have caused them or led to a child being placed in foster care, these children are a test case of what happens to stress neurobiology in the context of chronic adversity. And what these researchers have shown is that in the context of strengthening the capacity of foster parents as well as a child's biological parents to provide supportive, nurturing care, sometimes by reducing stress to those caregivers, you are able to find over a period of months that not only is children's behavior improving, they are developing secure attachments, they are acting in a more self-confident way, but careful testing is showing stress neurobiology is normalizing. The brain is rewiring itself. It is receiving new signals that say the world might not be as dangerous a place as we'd initially thought it was. And that is tremendously encouraging as a demonstration of the plasticity that inheres in early brain development. my bottom line message is that it is the relationships that are central, that we want all adults to be talking and singing and playing and interacting and storytelling and doing all the things that are important, we know, to helping to stimulate the developing brain. But we also want to recognize and hold out the fact that it makes a difference how that language is being used, and it makes a difference who is using that language. And that when it comes from people who matter, it has a significant effect in signaling the brain what kind of a world this is, what I can expect from it, and how I can prepare to live in this world, not just to survive, but to thrive. So I offer this as a message to you that you are in the process not only of shaping children's behavior, but also their brains, and to end as I began with my thanks for the good work that you're doing for them.